Hey everyone, Cool Kid here. Way back in mid-2022, I made a video titled Making the Sobek Overpowered, which went over a somewhat obscure strategy that combined the Acid Shell's augment mod with Saren's Toxic Lash ability. Well, in the 3.5 years since... Wait, it's been 3.5 years? That's messed up, I'm not gonna lie. Anyways, in the years since that video came out, a lot has changed. We've had new Archon shards, new augments for the Sobek, and even a Kuva variant was finally released. With how much the strategy has evolved in the time between then and now, I wanted to give the Sobek another look and push it even farther. I do want to note, while this is technically a sequel to my last video, I'm going to explain everything you need to know in this one too, so don't worry about watching it. I also want to attach an important disclaimer before we get into the video proper. What I'm about to show you is genuinely one of the most broken weapon Warframe interactions in this entire game. Normally, the overpowered in these videos' titles is pretty tongue-in-cheek, but I've been able to score over 400 kills a minute with this strategy. So with that in mind, I have a request to make of all of you watching. Please do not use this in public lobbies. It is legitimately so effective that your teammates will not be able to play the game, and being disruptive to other players' experience is the primary reason things get nerfed according to DE. If I go down as the guy who got the Sobek nerfed, I will cry, so please, stick to using this in private lobbies or solo play. All I ask really is that you use this knowledge responsibly. Alright, with that out of the way, what even is the Sobek? The Sobek is a Grineer shotgun that can be obtained by purchasing its blueprint from the market. It's got a solid status chance of 16.2%, high total damage at 350, 20 shells to a magazine, and a fully automatic trigger. Unfortunately, the weapon is 75% impact damage, has a slow fire rate at 2.5, low critical chance at 11%, low multi-shot at only 5 pellets, and a long reload of 2.7 seconds. Out of the box, Sobek is a shotgun with solid damage, high status, and a lot of ammo, counterbalanced by a long reload and slow fire rate. Something that makes Sobek especially unique is that it's one of the only weapons in the game to have 3 augment mods, all of which provide a significant bump in power. The first of these augment mods is Shattering Justice, which can be purchased from the Steel Meridian Syndicate at the Protector rank and above. This mod grants the Sobek a 90% bump in status chance that's additive with other status chance mods, as well as access to the Justice Syndicate effect. This augment is pretty good when the Syndicate procs damage is enough to kill things, but when it comes to raw power, it's quickly overshadowed by Clip Delegation, an augment that was released with Nora's Mix Volume 6 and can now be found in the Nightwave shop rotation. Clip Delegation grants your next magazine after a reload 15% more status chance and multi-shot for each shot landed with the current magazine. This mod grants 225% more status chance and multi-shot at its maximum of 15 stacks, and it's remarkably cheap at only 7 drain. This mod is an easy slot if you're using the Sobek in a more conventional manner, but our strategy here today revolves around the third and final augment, Acid Shells. Acid Shells is a mod that can be occasionally obtained after defeating Kayla de Thame, with a roughly 11% chance to drop. This mod causes enemies to explode on death, dealing a flat 450 corrosive damage as well as 45% of the enemy's maximum health as blast damage in a 15-meter radius. That probably sounds pretty solid up front, and it is, but this mod has a lot of quirks that need to be acknowledged. Firstly, the explosion has very aggressive falloff, going from 100% damage at point blank to 0% damage at the edge of its range. The explosion is also restricted by line of sight, unlike most AoE weapons, though with a 15-meter radius, that's honestly understandable. The percent health damage dealt by the explosion also doesn't take into account health increasing modifiers like those found in Archon hunts or on the Steel Path, which is a significant damage loss. Lastly, the explosion doesn't have any critical or status chance, so its damage and utility are both pretty rigid. Okay, so that's a lot of drawbacks. How on earth could this mod be the center of a strategy that, in my own words, is so broken it's disruptive to other players? Well, this augment has one trick up its sleeve I didn't mention. Enemies killed by the Acid Shell's explosion can then proc an Acid Shell's explosion themselves. This might not be super helpful quite yet because the damage of the explosions is so low, but do keep it in the back of your mind for now. So if the damage is too low to be useful, how do we go about fixing that problem? Well, if there's any advice I hope you remembered from the first video, it's that the more your setup violates the Geneva Conventions, the more damage it deals. Case in point, Saren's third ability, Toxic Lash. This ability instills all of Saren's weapons with a 30% bump in Toxin damage, though this damage is doubled to 60% for melees. The bonus damage scales with strength mods, and the buff duration scales with duration mods, unsurprisingly. Now, that sounds simple up front, but this ability has a lot of weirdness that I need to explain. First up, Toxic Lash isn't simply a boost in Toxin damage, but rather its own separate instance of damage that deals 30% of the weapon's total damage as Toxin damage. This separate damage instance also has a guaranteed Toxin proc, which deals 50% of the Toxic Lash hits damage per tick. Crits, headshots, and stuff like that all do affect the damage of this secondary hit, but there's a subtle thing I mentioned that some of you might have caught. It's 30% of your weapon's total damage, not its modded base damage. You see, in Warframe, most damage over time effects scale based on the weapon's modded base damage, which is the weapon's damage after base damage mods like Point Blank and faction damage mods are applied. This modded base damage is then passed through another formula that calculates additional damage using any mods that match the element of the DOT, as well as things like elemental damage boosts and faction damage mods again. Proc damage also increases with things like critical hits and headshot multipliers as well, which is noteworthy. What this means is that, from a modding screen perspective at least, a Toxin proc would only care about base damage, faction damage, status damage, and Toxin damage mods placed on the weapon. But because Toxic Lash is 30% of the weapon's total damage, it actually does increase in damage with elemental mods that aren't Toxin, and this property also extends to its Toxin procs. Even more interesting than that, Toxin damage mods are still considered for the boost in Toxin proc damage, so it effectively double dips with Toxin mods. On top of that, Toxic Lash also uses faction damage mods in the calculation a whopping 3 times, meaning that it triple dips with sources of faction damage. If that all wasn't impressive enough, Toxic Lash also has a unique synergy with Saren's first ability, Spores. If an enemy is hit by a Toxic Lash infused attack while they have spores on them, then that enemy will spread spores to nearby enemies. Because spores deal corrosive damage and also proc the corrosive status effect rapidly, this means that the two abilities can be used in tandem to reduce enemy armor on a map-wide scale. Okay, so with all of that out of the way, let's go back to Acid Shells. This ability has a very important interaction with this mod. The Toxin procs from Toxic Lash can actually trigger the explosions from Acid Shells if they kill an enemy, and said explosions can then trigger Toxin procs from Toxic Lash. This creates a chain reaction that, if you play your cards right, can clear out entire rooms. Because each enemy killed by a Toxic Lash proc gives off their own explosion, that means the 15-meter radius will center on that enemy when it triggers, so the damage can work its way through entire rooms so long as the enemies are within line of sight of each other. But this kind of damage isn't achieved through Acid Shells and Toxic Lash alone, so now it's finally time to talk about the finer details that really bring this all together, starting with the long-awaited Kuva Sobek. Compared to the regular Sobek, the Kuva variant has a few standout stat boosts. Better crit and status chance at 21% each, a better critical multiplier at 2.3 times, higher base damage at 385, and a faster reload at 2.1 seconds. Kuva Sobek also gains access to the Progenitor elemental damage bonus, which can go as high as 60%. It, also has more fall-off range, I guess? Now, these are all obviously big bumps to the Sobek stats, but there are some unique things to consider with this setup that make building around it pretty different. Because the Acid Shells explosion can't crit, the critical stats are useful for killing your initial target, but they don't have any bearing on the explosion damage. Because the explosions then trigger Toxic Lash procs based on their own damage, this means the bulk of any chain reaction won't care about the crit stats. Still, being able to kill your initial target faster is really useful, especially because you can quickly kill multiple enemies to get several chain reactions going right away. The Progenitor bonus also lends a hand, but do keep in mind that it's treated as base damage, so Toxin isn't necessarily going to be any more effective than any other element. Still, it is a big bump in damage over the regular Sobek. I also want to mention that the explosions from Acid Shells don't care about multi-shot either, and because they can't inflict status effects, the weapon's status chance is also pretty inconsequential. As such, both Clip Delegation and Shattering Justice aren't very useful for this strategy. I'm not saying you should outright abandon these stats, it'll take much longer to kill your first target without them, but investing heavily into multi-shot or status chance isn't really that helpful. Another quirk I want to highlight is the fact that Toxic Lash's damage scales with all elemental mods, not just Toxin. What makes this so interesting is that shotguns have access to 2 primed elemental mods, Chilling Grasp and Charred Shell. When used together, these 2 mods basically give you another 1.5 elemental mods of damage, which is hugely useful. This elemental scaling quirk is also really useful with another mod on Saren herself, Venom Dose. This augment lets Saren hold her first ability to infuse her weapons with corrosive damage, which is treated like you have a corrosive mod equipped. This starts at a whopping 100% more damage and scales with strength mods, which makes it pretty easy to get what is essentially a souped-up damage mod on your Sobek to be used by Toxic Lash for damage scaling. In a similar vein, I also want to highlight the triple-dipping nature of Toxic Lash with faction damage mods. Because it uses these bonuses a whopping 3 times when calculating damage, Roar is exceptionally effective for this strategy as it counts as a universal faction damage buff. Nourish is also a solid boost if you want to take it for the extra energy, as Nourish's viral boost doesn't hold a candle to the damage you'll get out of Roar. While we're on the topic of Saren, let's pivot to another feature that wasn't in the game when I made my first video, Emerald Archon Shards. These are useful for 2 major reasons. The first one is pretty obvious. The shards have a stat that boosts Toxin damage by 30%, or 45% if Tau Forged. Honestly, the bonus damage isn't really needed to a point, but you can use these shards to help pump your damage in exchange for more comfort or utility mods on the Sobek itself. The second major thing these shards can do is boost the maximum amount of corrosive stacks an enemy can be inflicted with. Using 2 regular shards, an enemy can get to 14 stacks, which completely removes their armor. Using 1 Tau Forge shard, you can get the enemy to 13 stacks, which reduces their armor by 98%. The main thing that makes this noteworthy is Saren's first ability, Spores, which can be used in tandem with Toxic Lash to melt away the armor of entire rooms. This strategy's main weakness in the last video was enemy armor, and while that was for a lot more reasons than I'm letting on, this 3-way synergy between Spores, Toxic Lash, and Emerald Shards makes it a non-issue the majority of the time. Alright, with all that out of the way, let's... Wait, is that the collective will of my audience? Hey cool kid, everyone here. Where is the build? Okay, fine. I normally don't like showing these things because I want my videos to be more educational than prescriptive, but I also know that if I don't show the builds off, then it'll be half the comment section. So then, looking at the Sobek, we've got Galvanized Hell, Primed Ravage, and Critical Delay, which are all used to make killing the initial target easier. We've then got the ever so important Acid Shells, as well as the primed variants of Point Blank, Chilling Grasp, and Charged Shell. This ribbon I have is just Toxin damage and fire rate, so if you don't have a ribbon of your own, you can just slot in Contagious Spread or something like that. I'm also using Galvanized Acceleration to boost the fall-off range, and Primary Merciless for the boost in base damage and reload speed. While not directly on the weapon itself, I'm also boosting my damage with Anabolic Pollination, a precept mod unique to the Ferropredicite. This grants me an additional 100% Toxin damage for 15 seconds whenever I touch the spore trail that my dog thing leaves behind, which is another significant damage bump. Moving on to Saren herself, the main stat you want is Strength to boost the damage of Toxic Lash, Venom Dose, and Roar. I've also got on a decent amount of Rain so that my spores can be spread to enemies more easily, and Duration is also nice to keep the buffs active. Energy Nexus and Preparation are both primarily to make ESO more comfortable, along with Arcane Energize. You don't need this amount of energy redundancy at all, I just hate running out, so I'm over-investing to make sure that it isn't a problem. Now, this build has basically no survivability, so I'm offloading that to my focus school by using Vazarin. I'm not gonna lie, not everyone is gonna like dashing through themselves every time their shield breaks, so if this doesn't work for you, then shuffle things around until you find something that does. This is the setup that I personally find effective, but as I've explained all of the mechanics of this strategy, you should have the tools to put something together yourself that might work better for you. I encourage you to play around with things until you find something that sticks, but this is the setup that I'll be running. Hey everyone, Editing Cool Kid here. Something I realized as I was working on this video was that I never showed my Archon shard setup, so I'll show that on screen now. Important thing to note real quick, the Toxin shards are additive with Elementalist, which is multiplicative with faction damage. If you're using Elementalist, you probably don't need them, but they are very, very strong. Now that we've covered everything from top to bottom, it's time to bring back everyone's favorite part of the original video. That's right, baby, it's montage time. Okay, now that we're through all that, I have a few footnotes I want to mention. First up, this strategy is actually not exclusive to Saren, as the explosions from acid shells have a similar interaction with resupply on Site 09. This opens up a lot of interesting opportunities, as Site isn't bound to toxin damage, which lets him combo acid shells with other DOTs like heat or gas on top of giving him infinite ammo. This strategy does have its drawbacks though. Site can't use Roar without replacing resupply, so his only real option is Nourish. He also doesn't have access to the damage boost from Venom Dose, which is a pretty sizable loss. Site is still an exceptionally strong user of this strategy, and most of the same wisdom applies to him, but as I find Saren to be more effective, I wanted to focus this video on her. Another Warframe who can use this strategy to great effect is Araxia, via her 4th ability, Silken Stride. This ability is very similar to Toxic Lash, dealing 40% of the weapon's total damage as a separate instance of Toxin damage with a guaranteed proc. This damage is doubled to 80% while Araxia is wall latching. Enemies killed by Silken Stride also trigger their own explosion, which caps at a 10-meter radius, and when used with acid shells, both of these explosions trigger each time an enemy is killed. Webbed Embrace's damage vulnerability is also really good for softening enemies up. She does have many of the same limitations as Sight, namely the lack of roar and venom dose, but she is still an incredibly effective user of the acid shells strategy. The second footnote I want to bring up is that acid shells isn't the only mod that can be used for this setup. Both Thermagnetic Shells on the Detron and Vulcan Blitz on the Jack Katag leverage similar mechanics, with those mods being obtained from the Index and Kayla Dethame respectively. I find the Sobek to be the most effective because it has 2.5 times the range of both of these mods, but they can be used if you want to try out a similar strategy in a different weapon slot. Mods like Concealed Explosives and Combustion Beam can also be used for this strategy as well. I don't mean to just gloss over all this stuff, but considering the performance of the Sobek and Saren, I didn't want to dedicate a bunch of time to these things. My recommendation is that, now that you know how these things work, go experiment and see what you can put together. Okay, the video is over now. Like, sub, join the Discord, all that stuff. I don't care enough to do a real outro this time, so, bye? I'm smoking on that Duviri Thrax Garden Dark Evil pack. They watered this shit with the blood of 36 aura worms. Shit's so purple it should be asking me, where's Albrecht? Tenno, this shit will turn your transference off. Room nuking levels of damage. Grenier slaughtering Orican Kush. Shit got gold trim on it. This is so hard to read. Shit got gold trim on it, so you know the base to multiplicative damage ratio is fucking swag, Tenno. A whiff of this shit? Yeah, this is that nefarious Silver Grove grass. This shit is straight out of Scholar's Landing. This is the shit that killed Ballas. Rip my gamer for real, dog. Peace.